I now have the honor of introducing our opening keynote speaker, Kashmir Hill. She's an investigative journalist, and boy, does she have stories to tell, focusing on privacy and technology. She specializes in first-person reporting, which has led her to live on Bitcoin, turn her apartment into a smart home, cut the tech giants from her life, and create a fake business and buy it a sterling online reputation. She'll now be joining, or she already has, joined the New York, next week, she's joining the New York Times as a technology reporter. Ms. Hill.
Good morning. My name is Kashmir Hill. I'm a technology reporter, and I've been writing about privacy for about a decade now. I started a blog in the mid-2000s called The Not So Private Parts, and it was dedicated to just chronicling the erosion of privacy, usually at the hands of technology. And privacy is kind of the other side of the coin of security. And I'm always trying to figure out ways to make people really care about privacy, because a lot of people say, oh, I don't really care about privacy. I don't have anything to hide. It's okay if people track me. So I'm always looking in my reporting for the real harms that come from the collection of our data. So for example, I studied the way that Facebook's friend recommendations worked. It's a feature called People You May Know. Have you ever gotten a creepy recommendation in your Facebook, People You May Know? Where they seem to know your real life friends in a way that they shouldn't. So I was trying to figure out, why that was happening, and essentially determined that it was because Facebook has this vast black book where they've collected contact information from, anyone who says, I want to find friends, they'll upload their contacts to Facebook. And Facebook keeps those contacts. And so Facebook had the contacts for millions of its users, and once you start having everybody's contacts, you're able to make these linkages between people and who knows who and who knows who. And so one of the things that was happening as a result of this, that was a concrete harm, is that sex workers who were using burner names, burner email addresses, burner phone numbers, were being connected with their clients through Facebook's People You May Know, and it was outing their real identities. So a lot of times through traditional reporting, I'm looking for these privacy harms. But sometimes I'll also immerse myself in the story, and I'll do these first-person stories. So for example, last year I did this story where we are trying to, this story is called The House That Spied on Me. And it actually originated from the FCC under Obama, the Federal Communications Commission, decided that internet service providers weren't going to be allowed to monetize the data that they were seeing from providing people's internet service. So they couldn't do the kind of reports that AT&T and Verizon, for example, do, where they look at what you're doing on your phone and where you are and everything they know about you, and they, anonymize it and aggregate it and sell it to advertisers. So the FCC passed a rule that ISPs couldn't do this, like Comcast and AT&T again. And the ISPs got pretty upset about it, and when the Trump administration came in, the FCC decided to reverse this rule and throw it out so ISPs can monetize that data. And my colleague and I, Surya Mattu, he's a technologist, we're trying to figure out how do we get people to understand this and care about this and understand the implications of not having this privacy rule. So we came up with this idea of building a home of the future that has all of these smart devices in it that are, collecting a lot of information about the people that live in the home. And I volunteered to live in the house. And Surya built a router. He used a Raspberry Pi that he set up. He named the network IoT. And I bought a whole bunch of crazy devices like a smart toothbrush and a smart mattress cover to go over my bed that had, it was crazy. It had like microphones and motion detectors in it to tell me how I could sleep better, and smart lights and smart plugs and a smart vacuum and a smart coffee maker, and basically anything you can imagine has been made smart. And we connected it all to this router, and then we kept track of the information that was leaving the home and coming into the home Companies are offering us all kinds of internet-connected devices. Being smart means the device can connect to the internet, it can gather data, and it can talk to its owner. But once your appliances can talk to you, who else are they going to be talking to? I turned my one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco into a smart home. Basically, the goal of the experiment was to find out how much it would be monitoring my family and myself. I already had an Amazon Echo, the smart speaker, we had a Vizio smart TV, but I bought a bunch of other devices.
I built a special router that let me look at all the network activity. We were seeing what our ISP could see, but more importantly, what they could sell.
We ran the experiment for 2 months. In that 2 months, there wasn't a single hour of digital silence in the house. One thing we discovered is that the devices, almost all the devices, talk to the companies that made them. The TV was sending a lot of information out about the Hulu shows we watched to data brokers, so people that track people's behavior. One of the funny things about living in a smart home is how easy it was to forget that all of these devices were recording us and tracking our activity. These things don't look like cameras. The coffee maker doesn't look like it's recording us. So it was really easy to forget that it was happening. What was significant to me about this is that it was allowing tracking to move off of computers and off of screens and actually into my home. And just getting this really basic, boring information, but revealing information about how we live our lives. I guess it just bothers me that it's like tracking moving into our physical lives instead of just in a place that we can kind of at least control because we're on a screen.
We've long been told that if it's free, you're the product. But with the Internet of Things, it seems even if you pay, you're still the product. So you really have to ask, who's the true beneficiary of your smart home? You or the company mining you?
So one thing that's not captured in that video is that living in the smart home was not just privacy invasive, it was just horribly inconvenient. It just seemed like the smart home technology wasn't quite ready for prime time yet, and things were just constantly, one day the lights would work and the next day they wouldn't, and every morning we started the day by trying to tell our Amazon Echo that we wanted our coffee maker to make us coffee, and so it had this particular phrase that we had to use. So every morning we wake up and we say, Alexa, ask the Be More to brew quick start, or I don't know, I can't even remember now, but every morning we couldn't remember it because we hadn't had caffeine yet. So we'd be kind of just yelling at the Echo Dot that was next to our smart bed to try to make us coffee. And she would say, Alexa would be like, I don't understand. What do you want me to do? And my husband would say, can I please just go to the coffee maker? Can I go to the kitchen and just push the button? I'd be like, no, we have to do it the smart way. So after that experience, I was just in the market for a story that involved getting away from technology rather than filling our lives with it. And so I'm always looking, somebody asked me at dinner last night, how do I come up with story ideas? And sometimes I come up with them on my own, and sometimes people suggest them to me. So if you ever have any ideas for a good story about technology, please send it my way. Somebody suggested to me that I try to cut Google out of my life. And they said, they were not a fan of Google, and they said, I think it's gonna be really, really hard. And I agreed with them, but I thought it would be a much more interesting story if I did it with all of the technology giants and compared them and see which is the hardest to cut out of your life. So came up with a story for Life Without the Tech Giants. It wasn't a particularly original idea. Lots of journalists have done stories about trying to quit Facebook, trying to quit Google, trying to get away from Amazon, and how hard it is. But usually they do this by just either deleting their Facebook account or not using Amazon.com or trying to go off Google products. And I really want to do this story on a deeper, more thorough level. So I went to a technologist, Dhruv Mehrotra, who I said, I want to do this story where I'm trying to get away from the tech giants. Can you come up with a technological way that I can cut them out of my life? Because I know as a technology journalist that we're interacting with these companies all the time invisibly, that they're there in the background. So is there a way for us to make that interaction visible and stop it from happening? And so he went into his Dhruv cave for a little bit, and he came back and he said, I think I have a pretty simple way to do it. It's not perfect, but I think it'll work. And so he said, all of these companies produce lists of all the IP addresses they control. And in some cases, it's a lot of IP addresses, like Amazon and Microsoft, which are so dominant in cloud computing, and some were kind of unimpressive. Like Facebook is really in the rear here. But he said, I can just create a virtual private network for you, a VPN. You can connect all of your devices to it, and when you're trying to block a particular tech giant, I'll just block their IP addresses. And so it should theoretically stop you from being able to use their services. What I wanted to do is block the tech giants from getting, my money, my data, my time, and my attention. So he didn't think it would, be the perfect solution, and we did run into some problems, but it worked fairly well. So we went ahead and started trying to do this. And I decided to start with the company that I thought would be the hardest, just because I was so reliant on it. And that was Amazon. We have a lot of Amazon stuff in our house, as you saw even from the video about the smart home. We had an Echo Dot. We had 2 Amazon Prime accounts, which people really made fun of me for this. When I published the story, there were a bunch of readers that were like, haven't you heard of Amazon Prime Household? You guys don't need to be paying for your own accounts. So we fixed that after this. We had 2 Prime credit cards. We both had a Kindle. We used Amazon Prime Video a lot on our TV. And we shopped often at Whole Foods. So first I had to cut these things out of my life. And, I went on kind of a side story where I went to Amazon and to Chase to find out more about the Amazon Prime credit card, because I was curious how much how much data they were actually getting from the credit card. And it was a very strange adventure, because neither Amazon nor Chase would tell me what data Amazon got every time I used my Chase credit card. And they just wouldn't give me a straight answer, which was even more disturbing, which was very disturbing to me. And since then, I only use my Amazon Prime credit card on Amazon, because I figure they know what I'm buying there anyway. I had to get rid of the Echo. And I was trying to figure out what to do with my Echo. I thought, I could try to just unplug it, but I'm afraid that my husband or the nanny will plug it back in. I thought, maybe I could put a Post-it note on it that says, like, don't use this. And I was telling Drew this dilemma, and he's like, why don't you just put it in a cupboard? And this very simple solution hadn't occurred to me, because the Echo has become such a fixture in our household. And we're not the only ones. I think 1 in 4 American households has a smart speaker now. But the rest of the things, I put it, we stopped using Prime, put the credit card away, stopped watching Amazon Prime Video, and there were a lot of other things that we had to stop watching too. The hardest thing about life without Amazon wasn't not shopping on Amazon.com, which that was hard for me. I was very addicted to Amazon.com. Ever since I became a parent, I kind of shop there incessantly. I have an Amazon app on my phone, and as soon as I think of something I need, I immediately just open the app and order it. So I had to figure out how to shop other places online. But the harder thing was life without Amazon Web Services. Because Amazon Web Services, a lot of people, when they think of Amazon, think of retail. But that is actually not where Amazon makes most of its money. The most profitable part of Amazon is AWS, which is a service that they just started. It was kind of like an engineering side project a decade ago that they created for themselves. And then they realized this would be a very useful tool for other businesses. And so they rolled out AWS, and it has just become the dominant player in the cloud hosting space. And so a lot of different sites and apps use AWS. So by blocking Amazon, whole parts of the web stopped working for me. A lot of websites I would go to just wouldn't load. A lot of the apps on my phone stopped working. My daycare had 2 different kind of surveillance apps where they would tell me, they would send us messages about my daughter. It would tell us, what they'd fed her, whether she had, they'd changed her diaper, whether she'd peed. It was really too much information, but it was one of the many apps that stopped working. And we also found out that we couldn't watch anything, because AWS is used by many of Amazon's competitors. Netflix stopped working, HBO Go stopped working. Even though Netflix and Amazon are fierce competitors in the entertainment space, Netflix is forced to use AWS to host their content, which was really surprising to me. And other things like Slack stopped working, Signal stopped working. It really took out a lot of different services. And I found that Amazon was just impossible to avoid. During that week, I was able to go to gizmodo.com, which is the site that I worked for at the time. And I was pleased. I was like, oh, well, at least my website works. And so I went to Gizmodo's, our tech team, and I said, oh, what do we use for hosting our website? I said, oh, we use AWS. But one thing we discovered, the flaw in our blocker, was that if there was a content delivery network or a CDN in front of the cloud service, then the blocker saw the IP address of fastly.com instead of AWS. So there was some content that was still sneaking through. So one, AWS was just impossible to block. And then even in the real world, it was really hard to avoid. So during this week, I had to order a phone holder for my car. And this is the kind of thing I would definitely have ordered from Amazon.com immediately in the past. But this week, I went online, I searched, and found one on eBay. So I order it from eBay. And 2 days later, I get home, and there's an Amazon Prime envelope, with Amazon's smiley face arrow. And it turned out that the seller uses fulfillment by Amazon to store and ship their product. So even when I was trying to order through competitors, I was still running into Amazon's infrastructure just because it's that dominant. So the next week, I did Life Without Facebook, which was technically, which was in many ways much easier to remove from my life. I deleted my Facebook account. I stopped using Instagram and WhatsApp. And I thought this would be a relief. I thought getting away from Facebook would be really nice. But I discovered that I really missed it, and I lost access to a lot of information by not having it. The week I did this it was both Halloween and it was the week of the election. And so on Halloween, I couldn't share photos of my daughter dressed up as Boo from Monsters, Inc., which was kind of like a reflex I had. And I also couldn't see what my friends had dressed up as for Halloween. And there was no other way to get that information. Facebook has just become the default place for sharing photos, Facebook and Instagram. And I also discovered it was just harder to talk to my friends about what was going on in the world, because everyone was talking about, the propositions they were going to vote for, or what they thought of local politicians on Facebook, and it was kind of hard to prompt those conversations in any other place. And so I just kind of lost this background access to news about my friends and my family. And it was during this week that one of my very good friends had her baby. And I didn't find out about it until 2 weeks later when I enabled my Facebook account, and it immediately was the first thing on the first thing at the top of the newsfeed. And so I called my friend, she lives in Philadelphia, and I was like, congratulations, I'm so happy for you, your daughter's so cute, and I'm so sorry I didn't call you before, I had no idea that you'd given birth. And she said, well, I just assume when I post something to Facebook that everybody I know will see it. And this is where Facebook, it was possible to cut out of my life. It wasn't like Amazon where I wasn't able to use the web, but it's just that people have become so dependent on Facebook for sharing news that by stepping away from it, you really miss out on learning things. And in some ways, it can be impossible to run a business if you're not using Facebook. So this week I talked to. There's Open Markets Institute is a political group in DC that's really been pushing hard on this idea of enforcing antitrust laws against the tech giants. And they created a spin-off group called Freedom from Facebook, and they do all kinds of stunts, like they'll fly banners over Facebook shareholder meetings and send letters to Sheryl Sandberg. And what they say is that because Facebook doesn't have any real competitors in the social networking space, they haven't been incentivized to protect users' privacy. And they really think that's why we're seeing so many scandals now around how people's data has been used. Google was, like Amazon, really hard to live without. Leaving Google meant, I used Google for everything. So I had to find a new search engine. I had to set up new email accounts. I had to get a new new mapping tools, a new way of keeping track of my appointments. I had to get a new browser because I use Google Chrome. And once I switched over to Google Chrome and Safari on my iPhone, I had to change the default search engine because Google reportedly pays billions of dollars to Mozilla and to Apple to use google.com as their default search engine just because of how valuable it is for them to be there by default. And my surprising finding this work is that MapQuest is still around, and it has an app. And so I ended up using MapQuest for much of this week, and I didn't quite give me as good directions as Google Maps does. The hard thing about going without Google is a big cloud provider. It's not as big as Amazon and Microsoft, but there were a few websites that didn't work. The harder thing was that Google assets were just all over the internet. Every single web page I went to had something from Google. Google Analytics, Google Ads, Google fonts were used by everyone. I kind of didn't know what Google Fonts was before I did this experiment, but apparently it's something that Google released around the same time they released Google Chrome, where it will loads the website faster, usually for normal people, because it caches the fonts, so it doesn't have to rely on your computer browser to have that available. But it meant that every time I went to any website, it would just take forever for the website to load because most of these sites would try to load Google's assets before they would load the site's own content. So I kind of felt like I'd been thrown back to the 90s when I was using, a modem to get online, and I would, go to a website and I would load it, and then I would have a book there, and I would read my book while I waited for. I think I was usually going to the Silverchair fan page back in my high school days, waiting for it to load. It was kind of a return to that for me. There were a lot of things. There were some apps and websites that were just broken by blocking Google. So I went to Dropbox, and Dropbox looked normal, and I would enter my email address, I would enter my password, and try to sign in, and just nothing would happen. So I kept, pushing the button over and over again. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on, why isn't it working? And so I look at the HTML for Dropbox's main page, and it has something like 12 different links to Google and to Google's privacy policy. And so I'm trying to figure out why that is. So I contacted Dropbox, and they said, we use this reCAPTCHA. It's like an invisible reCAPTCHA program provided by Google to make sure that someone coming to the page is a real person and not spam bot. And so because I was blocking Google, it looked to Dropbox like I wasn't human, and they weren't letting me log in. I also ran into a lot of problems when any website or app used any kind of mapping program. So Yelp is kind of like a famous enemy of Google because they're very upset about the way that Google used to kind of suck up their content and displayed it on the google.com search, and the way that it prioritizes Google results over Yelp results. So they've been trying to get regulators to go after Google for a very long time. So I was very surprised when I went to Yelp's website and the map didn't work because they used Google Maps. One morning I had a meeting, and I kind of waited to the last minute to leave, assuming I would take an Uber or a Lyft to get there. And I opened the Uber app, and it's waiting. I'm waiting for it to load, waiting for it to get to the point where I can enter the address, and it never got to that point. So I tried Lyft, and the same thing happened. Uber and Lyft just don't work if you're blocking Google because they rely on Google Maps, so you can't even enter the address of where you want to go if you're blocking Google. And so because of this, I was trying to understand, just how dominant Google is when it comes to mapping. And there's a site called BuiltWith that tries to categorize the different kind of contents and the different assets used by various sites. And according to them, Google Maps is used by, I can't see my own numbers, but I think it was something like 90% of websites, if they have mapping, use Google Maps. And I kind of discovered there was a lot of people that were upset online, developers, because Google had recently, Google Maps is so dominant because for a long time it was super cheap. It was super, it was like the best mapping app out there. Everyone started using it. And then Google recently decided that they're going to increase the cost for it. And people were really mad because they said, we don't have any alternatives. And all of a sudden, every time a user is doing a search, a mapping search, it's starting to cost us a lot of money. And they're trying to look around for alternatives. And there just wasn't a lot out there. And so it was kind of stumbling into these ideas around antitrust and monopoly and the downsides for consumers and businesses when a company gets too dominant in one area. Life without Microsoft wasn't that hard for me, just because Microsoft isn't really much of a consumer company anymore. So I gave up LinkedIn and Skype, which it uses, and I had to stop listening to the radio in my car because I'd been driving this Ford Fusion for months, and I hadn't noticed a little placard in the middle of the car that said, Sync powered by Microsoft, but apparently Microsoft had designed the software for the car. And it was super buggy, and I wasn't surprised when I looked into this to discover that this Ford Fusion was the last model that used Microsoft, and then they moved on to using other tech providers, initially BlackBerry, which I think must have been a real slap in the face to Microsoft. There are a few websites that stopped working just because Microsoft is the second biggest cloud provider after Amazon, and my library book app stopped working. The problem I discovered is that the blocker wasn't really good at blocking Microsoft just because Microsoft was something I was encountering more in the real world. So, if I went to use the BART, which is the public train in San Francisco, they use Windows servers. And so I was, relying on Microsoft there. I think a lot of the places that I would buy things at would use Microsoft servers in their point of sales systems. And so Microsoft is something I just couldn't avoid because it was so embedded in the real world. So my biggest takeaway from this is, I went back and looked at the Microsoft antitrust case from the 90s when a bunch of attorneys general and the Department of Justice decided to go after Microsoft because they did think it was getting too dominant in the technology space. And the big example of that everyone talked about was Netscape Navigator. And Netscape Navigator, when it first launched the browser, it was a browser that people paid for. I think they paid around $50 for it, unless you were in a university setting, in which case it was free. And Microsoft saw that the internet was going to be the next big thing, and they were afraid that Netscape would, dominate people's access to the internet. So they developed Internet Explorer, and they released it for free, and this really cut into Netscape Navigator's market share. So I guess that's kind of debated. But Netscape ended up releasing Navigator for free, and I kind of feel like this set off. It was part of the path to we get services for free, and then we give our data up in return rather than paying for things online. But the government went after Microsoft. It was a long, drawn-out case. Originally, they wanted to break up Microsoft. That's not what ultimately happened. Microsoft agreed not to essentially keep other competitors from being able to benefit from computer systems. But a lot of people say that Microsoft, it made them more cautious, and that because of this, competitors were able to rise, that this gave rise to Google and Amazon and Facebook. And so it just made me, and that's debated too. Some people think the Microsoft antitrust case mattered, and some people think it doesn't, that Microsoft just didn't kind of know what was going to happen next and wouldn't have been able to compete with them anyways. But it's an interesting point in history, and it just made me think a lot about whether we would be using more Microsoft services today if that antitrust case hadn't happened, and what that says about this present moment, whether there should be more pressure on the tech giants. Life without Apple was very hard for me just because I use an iPhone. I had a MacBook Pro at home and a MacBook Air at work. Apple was, my gateway to all things digital. So I got a Linux laptop from Purism, and I switched to. I kind of was like debating which phone to get because in my last week of this, I was going to cut all the tech giants from my life. So it's like, do I really want to go to an Android phone if I'm going to have to give it up the next week? So I ended up switching over to a Nokia 3310, which is, I don't know if anyone had that like 2 decades ago, but it's like the little brick phone that has Snake on it. And I discovered how hard it is to leave Apple, because when you leave Apple, you can't use all the things that you used when you were Apple. Like if I'd bought any music on iTunes, it was just no longer available to me. I discovered how hard it is to get your contacts out of Apple. When you have an Android, you can do like a Bluetooth connection, and send all of your contacts to another device. But with Apple, I had to go into the Apple cloud, and then I had to download I don't think it let me export all. I just had to download some of the contacts, and then I had to put it in a special file. Then I had to connect the Nokia to my computer, and then send that file to Nokia. It was just this like really prolonged process that was very difficult. And the first time around, my Nokia was like, oh, that's too many contacts. I had over 1,500 contacts on my iPhone, which was staggering. And so I ended up whittling it down to the number of people that I actually talked to on a regular basis that I thought I would actually want to talk to over this 2-week period. And it was funny because the number ended up being 143 people. And do people know Dunbar's number? So Robin Dunbar was this British sociologist who was studying human groups. And he basically said that we human beings are only able to really keep 150 people kind of in our mind at one time. That's like the number of people that you can recognize their face, their backstory, you can keep track of their names. It's like a functioning human group. And he looked at all of these different social groups over time, and he found that it was often, military groups often form into units of 150, or religious groups, or neighborhoods. Like 150 is this kind of natural number for us. And even though technology lets us connect with so many more people, thousands of people on Facebook, thousands of people in your iPhone, I had over 6,000 contacts in my Gmail. At the end of the day, there's still only really 150 people that I could keep in my life. And it just made me think a lot about why we feel so stressed out about technology. And maybe it's because it is allowing us to be in touch with more people than we can really keep in our heads. So yeah, I had never really understood why so many people who don't use Apple hate Apple so much, but I understood once I tried to get away from it, and I kind of saw how unwieldy a lot of Apple's strategy is, the way that it locks you in to its ecosystem and doesn't let you get out. So anyways, this Reddit post really made me laugh. So that blogger that I talked about at the beginning of the talk didn't just block me from being able to communicate with the tech giant servers. It also kept track of how often my devices were trying to talk to them. And so when I was blocking Amazon, even though I was trying to stay away from all Amazon products, my devices ended up pinging Amazon servers, or trying to. They were blocked from doing so almost 300,000 times. With Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple, it was all about the same, 15,000. But Apple, I think, was kind of an anomaly because it was so hard for me to get away from Apple that the first day I had to keep using the iPhone to find things and going to the iCloud to get my contacts out. And then Google was over 100,000 times. So it kind of, those numbers give you a sense of the dominance of these particular companies in the actual infrastructure of the web. It is not possible to avoid Amazon and Google. So in the last week, I decided to block all the tech giants, which is definitely the most challenging week. It was hard to do, especially just with the phone, because Apple and Google have a duopoly on the smartphone market. And so if you don't want to use those two companies, you're really forced to go without a smartphone. And I think we've become very dependent on the services that the smartphone provides in terms of being able to find things, being able to access the internet on the go, being able to see email. So I had to go back to using that dumb phone, and that was probably the biggest kind of technological change in my life as a result of trying to avoid the tech giants. There's a lot of services that these companies now control. Over the past decade, they've bought over 400 other companies and startups, and they've faced no pushback from regulators. The one that people are really starting to look at is now Facebook, because it acquired Instagram and WhatsApp. And so kind of antitrust critics say it owns too much of the social networking space, and you kind of can't get by in life if you're not using one of these tools. But I actually think one of the more troubling ones is Google, because everyone is dependent on Google search, and then Google also has just this thriving ad analytics and tracking system in Google in its purchase of DoubleClick. But it's just really hard to avoid them. So cutting the tech giants from my life really meant cutting the internet from my life. And it was, in many ways, it was kind of like nice to step away. But I also realized what a privilege this is, because I gave a talk about this experiment in Kosovo last month. And I was talking about, I couldn't use Google Maps and couldn't use Amazon, and people that are like, we never get to use them. Like, Google Maps doesn't work here. Amazon.com doesn't deliver here. And, these companies do offer a lot of benefits. And so when I talk about this experiment, I'm recognizing some of the downsides, but they do offer us a lot of services, and it's kind of a privilege that we get access to them. I just think that we're realizing more and more now some of the downsides and drawbacks and what we gave up in exchange for kind of amazing free services. So this was my kit for the week, because I couldn't read a reading app on my phone. I couldn't use a Kindle. I just got a lot of real books. I was reading the Wheel of Time series this week. I had to use, we were making videos to go along with the story, and so I had to go back to using my digital camera, my Canon I think it was from my college days, judging from the photos that were still on it. My Nokia phone, I often use my iPhone to take notes and record during interviews, but I had to go use my Zoom recorder. And I needed to use cash a lot, just because I didn't know if the tech giants were powering the point-of-sale systems in different places where I was shopping, and I just was trying to avoid them. Oh, and then I had to use a physical calendar, I kept forgetting it, and then I have lost, thanks to the tech giants, I've lost the ability to keep appointments in my head anymore, and so if I left the calendar at home, I just had no idea what I was supposed to do that day. Definitely the biggest lifestyle change of the tech detox was the phone. And it was funny, so I called Nokia up because so I started using the Nokia phone, and I was talking to somebody from Purism, and he was like, oh yeah, Nokia used to have such great mapping abilities, but then Microsoft bought them. And I was like, oh no, I'm using a phone from Microsoft. But Microsoft did buy Nokia for a lot of money, and it had it for about a year, and then it decided it didn't want to get into the phone market, and so it sold it for a lot less money to some former Nokia executives who had started a new company called HMD Global, and also to Foxconn, the company famous for making iPhones. And so Foxconn developed the developed the operating system for the higher-end versions of Nokia. But I reached out to HMD Global, and I said, why are you still making this old, dumb phone? Who is buying this besides journalists that are doing stunts for their reporting? And they said originally they re-released it in 2017, and a lot of people thought it was kind of a joke, just because there's all these memes around how indestructible the Nokia 3310 is. But their original plan was to sell it in Africa and Asia, places where they thought people would be interested in a dumb phone because their internet connection wasn't up to the capabilities of a smartphone. But they have found that it's actually sold really well in the US. And part of it is parents who buy this phone for their children so that their children can call and text but not have access to the internet and all the horrors that await them there. But they also are trying to pitch the phone in the way that I was using it, as a detox phone. So if you feel like you're too addicted to your smartphone, you could just slip the SIM card out and put it into this Nokia 3310 and then just use it for a couple of weeks. And that is how it functioned for me. Before I started using the Nokia, every morning when I woke up, I would reach for my smartphone, and it was just the first thing I did every day. Before I, touched or talked to my husband, before I interacted with my daughter, I would just start, mainlining the internet. And the phone was just kind of setting my agenda for the day. And it's the first thing that I would think about, and it was the last thing I would do at night. And so when I got the switch over to the Nokia, I kind of did that at first, and I would reach for it, and I'd realize there's just nothing there. Like, no one had texted me overnight. I didn't have any missed calls. And that was all the information that would be on the phone. And so I really got out of the habit of grabbing my phone first thing from the bedside table. And it was really nice. I was like, wow, I don't like starting my day looking at my phone. And so ever since I did this experiment, really the biggest change in my life is that I turn off my phone at night now, which before I would never turn off my phone. The only way my phone would be turned off is if the battery died. And this has just been, I turn it off around 9 o'clock at night, and I don't turn it on the next day until 8 a.m. or whenever I really need to plug back into the internet for work. And it was just a really nice and dramatic change in my life. And the only problem is once you start using your phone less, you notice that how much everyone around you is using their phone. And so it's kind of become a point of tension with my husband now, because I'm like, you're always looking at your phone, and and he's like, I did not do the tech detox that you did. And as part of doing this, I met people for whom this isn't a crazy weird experiment. That there's a lot of people that are part of the open source movement and the free software movement who are trying to build alternatives to the tech giants, and I relied on a lot of their tools when I was doing the experiment. So some of the alternatives that I used were, for search, I used DuckDuckGo, though I couldn't use them for that last week because they use AWS. Startpage is a European search engine that's kind of got a emphasis on privacy, and that one didn't work for me when I was blocking Facebook for some reason. But DuckDuckGo is different from Google in that it doesn't keep the history of searches connected with an individual. So it's not kind of tracking you over time. I was telling someone at dinner last night that if I were forced to give up my privacy in some way, and someone said, either you have to let a stranger, look through your email or look through your Google searches, I would definitely choose to let that stranger look through my email, because I think that we tend to reveal so much of ourselves to Google and search engines just because we think of it as a robot, as something that's not judging us. And we ask it some of our most private questions about what is this rash, or why is this thing happening to my body, and it's kind of disturbing when you think about the fact that that's just being collected over time and used to profile you and used to provide advertising to you. And it's just become such a natural part of how we navigate the web. For browsers, the alternatives were Brave and Firefox and Tor. For file sharing, this was one of the hardest things I had to do. I did an interview with Reply All, the podcast about kind of technology and modern life, and with my Zoom recorder, and then I hit a huge file at the end of it because it was an hour-long talk, and I was trying to figure out how to get it to Alex Goldman, who's the host of Reply All, and he was like, well, can you just put it in Dropbox? I was like, no, Dropbox doesn't work for me. I looked at all these other file-sharing sites, and everybody used AWS, so ended up finding an open-source tool called OnionShare that was created by a technologist named Michael Lee, who works for The Intercept. And the only hard thing was I couldn't go to onionshare.org to download it because he used AWS to host his website. So I had to kind of get it directly from his server using command line language. For hardware, I switched over to using Purism, which is this San Francisco or Bay Area-based company whose ethos is to end, they say, I'm trying to think of how they put it, end data slavery. They want people to be able to control their own data, host their own data, not have to rely on proprietary services that have emails and passwords and constant data capture. And so they provided the laptop that I used, which was, after using Apple for so long, I wasn't sure, how difficult it would be to use a new computer. I also, the only people I knew who used Linux computers were like all of my hardcore developer friends. So I thought I was gonna be having to Matrix style figure out my computing, but then I discovered, Linux computer, they've made it so it's just like a regular computer, and it was not hard to use at all. The only things I ran into is it had this switch for turning off the microphone. It would cut the microphone, cut the camera. It was like a security feature, and I didn't know the switch was there, and so I was trying to use some video chat service, I think Jitsi, and it wasn't working, and I couldn't figure out why, and it's just because I'm not used to having all of these security bells and whistles. Use Nokia for my phone. Purism is actually working on a non-tech giant smartphone called the Librem that's supposed to be released soon. But at the time I did the experiment, there just weren't any other smartphone alternatives that didn't involve Google or Apple. For email, I switched over to Proton Mail and RiseUp. For video chats, I really like Jitsi.org, which is this open source video chat service that, unlike Skype, you don't have to have an email or a password. You can just spin up an instance for a video chat, and you can just talk to somebody, and then you're done. And it was kind of revelatory to me that you can have these services without having to be dependent on them forever. For social, I tried to use Mastodon, which is this open source, decentralized kind of version of Twitter. But the hard thing about trying to switch to a new social network is it's not very interesting if there's no one you know on that social network. And so this was actually one of the hardest things to get away from. Without Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp, there was no other way to just kind of mass communicate with my friends. And texting was really hard because on the Nokia, it's like T9 texting. And so I kind of gave up texting, and I just started calling people. And it was kind of funny because every time I called somebody, they would pick up on the first ring, and they'd be like, "Kashmir, what's wrong?" And it's because I never call anybody. And so anyways, it was just fun to kind of catch up with people by voice. So this was for the last week. This was how often. Okay, so this is a week where I'm only using a computer. I'm using a Nokia phone that doesn't have access to internet, but this is still how often my computer, basically just my computer, was trying to talk to the various tech giants. And so again, Amazon and Google are just outliers because Google is on every single website, and Amazon powers many websites. And the times I ran into Facebook, it was usually, Facebook does have trackers around the web. Specifically, they have something called Facebook Pixel, which is really responsible for many of the creepy ads that people see. So if you are on a shoe site and you look at a particular shoe, a lot of the retailers now will have this Facebook Pixel on the page, and so Facebook essentially sees that you are there, and so then they can retarget you on Facebook, and that's why you'll see an Instagram ad for something that you've looked at. And I think Facebook is tracking people even more and more in the real world, and it's why some of those ads are so on target now, like with Bluetooth beacons. And Microsoft still I ran into a little bit, but Apple I really didn't run into at all. I know Apple has kind of been putting a big emphasis on how it's the company that offers privacy. And to a certain extent, that's just marketing. But it is true that if you stop using Apple, Apple doesn't track you. They're not interested in gathering data about people who don't use their products, but they are really interested in locking in the customers that are using their products. So, it's easy to stay away from Apple if you don't use them, but it's hard to get away from them if you do. So this leaves us with this question of like, well, what do we do about it? And it's been really funny for me to see the way that this story has kind of traveled through the ecosystem. I heard that a lot of people were reading it in DC, and it was coming up a lot in antitrust talks about, well, look at this, like, it's not possible to not use these companies. You know, if you're a critic of Facebook or Google, if you don't like the way they're treating your data, a lot of people say, if you don't like Facebook or Google, just don't use them. But my experiment showed that it's not possible to avoid the tech giants, especially Google and Amazon. So this kind of story was coming up a lot in antitrust hearings, that these companies are too dominant, you can't avoid them. But then I've also heard it used on the other side, people saying, we shouldn't regulate these companies. They offer such useful services. Like, look at this poor woman who tried to avoid these companies. Her life was hell. So you can really, I guess you can do with the story what you want to do with it. But in terms of like what we do about how dominant these companies are, there's, I came into contact with people, two groups of people with different ideas. And so one was the groups of technologists. And so these are the open source free software people who I kind of met through this. Groups like Rise Up and May 1st in New York. And they're just trying to build alternatives so that if you want to do a video chat, you don't have to use FaceTime, you don't have to use Skype, you can use Jitsi. You can use services where you don't have to have a username and a login, and you're not, I mean, one frustrating thing that happened to me with, again, that same friend who had announced her baby's birth on Facebook. She wanted to talk to me and do a video chat with me. And so she FaceTimed me on my Nokia phone. It just wasn't working. And she's like, why aren't you FaceTiming with me? And I was like, I don't have an iPhone right now. Like, can we use another service? She's like, no, I don't use other services. Just let's talk when you get your iPhone back. So I just discovered like how these technologists want to give us services where you and the person you're talking to don't have to use the same proprietary software. So they want more services like that, and they talked a lot about trying to make these technologies more interoperable, like email. You can have Gmail, and I can have Hotmail, and you can use Microsoft Office, and we can still all talk to each other. It's not like you have to have a Gmail account to talk to somebody else who has a Gmail account. And so they would love if more services were more interoperable. So you don't have to be on Facebook to get invited to a Facebook event. Maybe they can just like invite anybody, or invite somebody who uses Pinterest, or you invite somebody who uses Mastodon. They kind of have this grand vision of everything being interoperable, and we can all talk to each other from different services and we don't get locked in. I think that one is less likely to happen just because that would require re-engineering a lot of different software, but it's certainly an idea. And yeah, they want people to be able to store their own data rather than having it be in these vast servers getting used in ways that we don't know. And yeah, there's some people that do that. They store their own data, have their own email servers. But it's hard, I think, for normal people to do that. I met this really interesting technologist. His name is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore, and he works at the ACLU. And he is a digital vegan, where he tries to avoid all the tech giants. He doesn't even have a phone at all, which I thought was amazing. And he says, like, I don't want to be the bait on social networks that forces other people to join. So he's not on Facebook. He does use GitHub because he's a coder. But it was a really interesting choice, and I think about that every time I post a photo of my daughter to Instagram now, that I am forcing all these other people who want to see photos of my daughter, mostly my family and my husband's family, to be there to see them. And then on the other side, there's the policy approach, and that's the question of like whether the tech giants do need to be broken up. If they've become monopolies and they're too dominant in their industries such that other competitors are not able to break into the space at all. And a lot of people are pointing to the fact that there's fewer new startups now, just because, I mean, what startup would try to provide an alternative to Facebook at this point? Beyond DuckDuckGo, what other company is trying to offer a new search engine? And so they think that the companies need to be broken into parts just to allow other other companies that could provide us with better services, that could provide viable alternatives. And they're starting to get some traction. And I think it's because a lot of people have realized how powerful the tech giants really are now, the extent to which they control the tech infrastructure. I started to think of it as if, the internet is still pretty new, and it's really been built just over the last couple of decades, and it's kind of like been very haphazard. There are nonprofit groups that would spin up to kind of control one set of standards, and it just kind of came together, I don't know, in like a herky-jerky way, and the tech giants have really provided a lot of that infrastructure. Like, it's amazing that Amazon provides AWS, and anybody can spin up a company really easily. But I started to think about it as if online, the tech giants are the government, who built the highways and built the roads that we all use. And because of that, they're very powerful. They control the infrastructure. They control the places where we go to socialize and work and find people to date and express ourselves. And I think people are starting to see the downsides of that, whether you're a conservative and you're concerned about the way that censorship is being applied to voices that are conservative, or if you're a liberal and you're concerned that these tech giants gave data away in a way that made it possible to elect Trump. People are really realizing how powerful the companies are and what we do about that power. So my biggest takeaway is that after the experiment, as I said, I switched away from trying to really not to look at my smartphone as often and trying to turn it off more often, and just trying to kind of use technology a little bit less in my life, not shop on Amazon.com as much, buy things in the real world, or at least buy things from other sites. And I'm still using my alternative email services, but it is hard to step away, and it is a privilege to step away. And if you're a worker at a place where you have to have an iPhone app to be able to choose your shift for the week, you can't choose not to use a smartphone. So I do think that we need to think about societal and policy solutions for this, just so that people have more freedom and choice in their lives. So that was the experiment. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to me. And if anybody wants to contact me, this is my email address, my Proton mail address, and I'm Cash Hill on Twitter. Thanks.